Hi, so in this video, we'll be exploring the basics of recursion, which is basically just a repetitive function. So again, here, the recursion can be defined as the process of defining something in terms of itself. Basically, when you write a function and you want something to be called over and over again, so far we used for loops, while loops, etc. But recursion is another option that can be used to do the same thing. So loops and recursion are interchangeable, but sometimes it's more advisable to use recursion because it makes your code more efficient and easier. But the developer should be careful with recursion because it is a little tricky to understand and execute properly. And if it's not done properly, you can go into a code that never stops. So you need to be very clear with the conditions of the code you're writing and how it's going to execute. So some advantages of using recursion are that it can split down a complicated function into smaller subproblems by just writing the code once and it'll just keep executing itself again and again. And sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, sequence creation is simpler than using a nested loop. And recursive functions make the code more simple and more effective. Some disadvantages are that sometimes a lot of memory and time is taken as the function calls itself again and again. And again, like I mentioned, recursion is tricky, so it's a little challenging to debug if you are facing any issues. And because, again, it's a little difficult, the reasoning behind recursion can be tough to think of. Now, there are two types of recursion, and those are direct recursion and indirect. Direct recursion is when a function calls itself repeatedly as part of its execution, and indirect recursion is basically two functions or more functions within the recursive function that call themselves again and again. And this is a little bit more complex. Now, the syntax for recursion is basically, like I said, we're defining a function that is just going to repeat again and again until it reaches a base case value. We'll see what this means in an example later. But basically, you do this as you would define any other function. So here we've defined a function called recursive function with the input parameters, and we've used an if-else statement within it. So if the base case condition is reached, which is the final thing that you want printed, it'll return this and it'll stop calling the function again. Else, it'll keep calling the function. As you can see here, it'll keep calling the function again. And what we mean by modified parameters here is there'll be a condition in between that changes the input so that it keeps on going. We'll see what this means now in an example. So in this example, we want to print the numbers 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 till 0. And we've defined a function called countdown with an input n. So here we've called the function by giving it the input 5. So first what will happen is this 5 will go into the function, and the first line is print n. So we'll get 5. Then if n is equal to 0, it will return, which means the function will stop. Here, n is not equal to 0, n is 5. So it'll go into the else, and it'll give us n minus 1. So n minus 1 will go back into the countdown function, and now our function is starting with 4. So it'll print 4, which is what we got here. And again, it'll check if n is equal to 0, which it's not. So it'll go into the else statement, and we'll get n minus 1, which is 3. So now 3 will go back into the function, and it'll just run again till we reach 0. Now, what happens when we reach 0? The if part of the statement is going to be active. So we'll get if n is equal to 0, it'll return. So return means the function is going to stop, and we'll just get 0 printed. So this is recursion. We'll look at a few more examples later on in the course.